Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to another episode of Gen Ed. I'm your host, Lewis, joined by the amazing Alana. And today we have a very special guest for you. She is the student community manager at Postman from Portland, Oregon, and a former Japanese translator and interpreter. It's Claire Froelich. Did I pronounce that right?
Spot on, spot on.
Perfect,
Yeah, I don't.
perfect.
You pronounce it better than I do. So.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself, Claire.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me, Alana and Lewis. I am excited to be on your show because I know a lot of your listeners are thinking about what they might want to do after high school, and me myself, I'm a very curious person, and it was hard for me to decide what I wanted to do. So I'll be talking a little bit about the strange meandering path I have taken and the places that it's taken me along the way. Yeah, so like you said, I'm actually not from Portland. It's what my LinkedIn says. I'm from a tiny town called
Oh,
Corvallis in Oregon, but I haven't lived there really in over a decade.
So take us back to when you were, I guess maybe like when you were a child. Like, what did you want to be when you grow up? Like, I know sometimes you're like, oh, I want to be a veterinarian, or I want to be a doctor, or a
I wanted
firefighter.
to be
What
a
did you
detective,
want to
for
be as a
example.
kid growing up?
Yeah, it depends on what day of the week. Oh, really? Do you still want to be a detective, Lewis?
I do not still want to be a detective. But for your day of the week, did you wake up on Monday, say you wanted to be a doctor, wake up on Tuesday, say, you know what, I think I'm going to go into translation?
No, I don't think I ever had those aspirations when I was a kid, actually. Actually, I wanted to be a construction worker
Hmm.
for a large part of my younger life. And I just loved building things physically. And when I was in high school, I took like woodworking classes and welding classes um, for like almost every year of my high school. And I thought that's what I wanted to do. But, the world is just too interesting. And I kept going on all of these tangents, and I'm still kind of a generalist in that everything is so interesting to me.
You know, you should have come as a kid to Montreal. We have amazing construction worker benefits here, okay? We have $25 per hour. You watch one guy dig a hole, and there are 5 of you watching this one guy dig a hole. And you're getting paid to do that. So it's an amazing job in Montreal, and there's constantly work because the potholes never go away. They just
I
keep
was going
coming
to
back.
say, it looks like you have very good job security because when I was in
Oh yeah,
Montreal, it was endless construction.
yeah. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's a great place for construction workers.
Well, it turns out that wasn't my path. So,
So I did on my little online stalking phase pre-interview, I found out that you went to Washington State University and you majored in electrical engineering for one part, and I believe you got a degree from that. And so I could tell that you're very hands-on and wanted to do construction, so I can see why you would go down that engineering route. So what made you interested in that, and then what made you change from like engineering to linguistics?
yeah, good question. And I'd like to say, don't trust everything you read on LinkedIn. Like, my career, my educational path does not fit in the little boxes that LinkedIn provides. So, yes, I did. My first year of university, I went to Washington State University, and when I was a high schooler trying to decide, okay, what should I study? My favorite classes at that time were physics. And the most exciting part of learning physics for me was like electromagnetism. And I was like, okay, well, if I'm going to go into an engineering type of field, I definitely want to do electrical engineering. And I actually got a scholarship and started out my first semester as an engineer. But after the first semester, I changed course. So I did not get a degree in engineering.
But you switched. You switched to, I cannot remember which university, but from the looks of it, you first did like a year abroad and then you switched to another university, or?
Yeah, so again, LinkedIn is going to be hard to follow. I actually went to 4 universities in 4 years.
Hmm.
So I became the master of the transfer credit. And of course, like 2 of those universities were study abroad. So the first year I did at Washington State, I started in engineering. And while the topic of electromagnetism and physics was really exciting for me. I really felt like maybe I don't have the brain that's built for this. Like, I don't mean that in like a sexist way. I just mean like how I function. Like, I don't think I was I'm not built to be a very logical person, which is not good for engineering. And at the same time, I had another passion, which was language. So while I was studying engineering, I was also doing Spanish and Japanese at the same university. And university in the US is very expensive. So I decided to transfer universities to a cheaper one my second year in Montana because I decided I'm not doing engineering anymore. I'll do Japanese as my main study, and they have a good Japanese program there. So in between Washington State and University of Montana, I did a summer in Lima, Peru, doing a little research at a university, and the fourth university was a year in Tokyo at a university called Sophia University.
I'm curious, do you remember precisely the moment or the last straw, or what was it that made you want to definitely change from electrical engineering to translation, linguistics, and Japanese, and what made you decide actually that Japanese was the way to go? Why didn't you go into linguistics or into Spanish, for example?
Yeah, I wish there wasn't a defining moment. I just knew right away that engineering I was not cut out for. I still had a passion for it, but I thought I couldn't contribute to engineering in a meaningful way in this lifetime. And I also am kind of lazy. And I found out that if you study a language, you don't have to write a thesis. So that was appealing.
That was the defining moment.
Yeah.
Not having to write a thesis.
Yeah, but both of you picked these really fancy fields of study, so have fun with your thesis. But
Oh, yeah, I have more than one.
yeah, enjoy. But as to why Japanese over linguistics, I mean, I actually did all three at once. I was studying Japanese, I minored in Spanish, and almost minored in linguistics. If I stayed like for one more class, I would have had a minor. But that's all on paper.
I was wondering, what was it like to research? I know you were researching Japanese immigration in Peru, so what was that like? What was that experience like?
Yeah, so that summer in Peru, I went with a group of students from my Washington State University, and we had the opportunity to conduct research there, and I was trying to decide what to research. And by a fluke, I found out that, when I was in high school, I studied abroad in Japan in like the very, very countryside for a summer. And I found out that some family from that host family I had in Japan had immigrated to Peru like way back in the 1900s. So there was this strange connection there, and I was like, what's going on? And I found out there was actually quite a massive migration of people from Asia to Peru in the 1900s, and it was just I found a topic that was interesting to me to research.
I'm kind of confused though. How were you able to research? Like, this is kind of a sociology topic. How are you able to research something like that when you were doing an engineering program? Because I know personally, at least at my university, I would not be able to do something that is so like different from what my prescribed major is. Is that something that was specific to Washington State? Well, obviously,
Yeah.
I'm sure you don't know exactly what all the different programs at all American universities, but was that part of the program at Washington State?
Well, again, I'll remind you, I was an engineer for one semester. But at the same time, I was studying Spanish. So it was through the Spanish department that we have this relationship with the university in Lima, and that's how I got there.
Okay.
So you can study more than one thing at once for sure. Like for anybody listening, like especially if you aren't sure what you want to dedicate the rest of your life to, and don't think that what you study in university necessarily dictates what you do the rest of your life, you can definitely put your thumb in different pies at the same time.
And even in different universities at the same
time. In different continents, yeah.
So how was your study abroad while you were in high school in Japan? How did you even get the opportunity to go?
Oh, I'm so grateful for these like little summer opportunities for young children to go abroad. I mean, I feel really bad for the students like this year and last year that are probably being stripped of that opportunity because of the pandemic. But for me, I went through a program called oh my goodness, I can't even remember the name. I got a scholarship called the Bridging Scholarship, and I can't remember the program. I think it was AFS. American Field Service, and they do short-term homestays. But there's a ton of programs out there like that. And if you're a student not knowing what to do with the summer, like at least in the U.S., summer vacation is quite long, so you have an opportunity to go. I recommend taking that opportunity because that was a once in a lifetime. It was a life-changing experience for me and why I started studying Japanese ultimately.
Where did you go in the countryside, if I may ask?
So I was in a tiny, tiny town called Yameshi in Kyushu, which is the southern island of Japan.
Okay. Already I know I wouldn't be able to survive there. Too hot.
Yeah, no,
Too
all
far
of it
down
sweating already, and then it was like swimming in humidity. It was so hot there.
I've already know, like, Okinawa is already on my blacklist. Like, if ever I go to Japan, I won't be able to go there. Like, too far down south. I'm gonna stick up to Hokkaido and like just stay up in the north where it's cold, where the climate is like my own.
Well, that's the cool thing about Japan. It's this one big banana country where, like, if you can choose what climate range you enjoy.
Actually, speaking of Hokkaido, so one of your first jobs was actually working in Sapporo, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you were working, I think, for the government, but also for local groups. What was that like? And what was concretely the work that you were doing there?
Oh, yeah. It was a strange opportunity. So I landed this job in Sapporo right out of university through a program called the JET program. And maybe some of your listeners have heard of the JET program, maybe not, but it's mainly known for placing English speakers in elementary schools, high schools, and middle schools in Japan to give authentic
to teach English.
Language lessons. Yeah, that's the ALT position. But a lesser known role in the JET program is one called CIR, which stands for Coordinator for International Relations. And it sounds like some UN role, but it's not that fancy. This role, it just places you in municipalities, like in city halls or town hall kind of organizations, and you work for the government depends on where you're placed. You might be an interpreter, translator, you might be working like doing cultural seminars, but it's not teaching English. You're working in Japanese and it's kind of a cultural ambassador type of role, but in my case it was a largely interpreting translation and these going to elementary schools and teaching about America.
So was it a big transition going from America to Japan? I know you studied some Japanese, so was it like a huge learning curve? Like, did you show up like lost, trying to read the map, trying to figure out where to go?
Yeah, well, for me, like I kind of thrive on being plopped in a really new environment. Like I went to a different university every year. I get really excited to have a chance to start over. And coming right out of university, this is like my first job where I wasn't like working in a kitchen or, so I had nothing to compare it to. Everything was new. But yeah, it really felt like being one of those little yellow Google dudes that you pick up on the Google map and you just plop them in the middle of a new place. And I was working totally underqualified as an interpreter translator for the mayor of Japan's like fifth largest city of 2 million people. And that was an extremely special opportunity. It was, I was doing the whole old school Japanese office type of attire situation with wearing a suit and heels, and the office customs were very traditional. Like the fax machine was a legitimate tool of communication. Somebody in our office lady would cut out newspaper clippings every day and paste them onto white pieces of paper and pass them around the office, and we would each stamp with our name that we've read all the newspaper clippings. Every morning we would have what's called chore, which is like the formal morning stand-up where we take turns asking each section head what the news is, and you have a turn to give an impromptu speech each time. So I had nothing to compare it to, and I don't think I'll ever be able to compare it to another job in the future.
That really sounds like, first of all, the most fascinating experience ever. I don't think I've ever heard of a job where you have newspaper clippings you have to read, and then people go around summarizing the news of the day.
I mean, it makes sense when you're working in the city to like know what's going on in the city, but
quite true. Yeah. But still, I mean, Japan's fifth biggest city, you would think that they would have other methods of communication. I hope they at least have a social media officer by now.
Yeah, well, I don't know. But there's something extremely special about well, I'll say like in my 8 years that I've been working now, like I've worked in very different types of places, and this is certainly one of the different ones. First of all, it's government, so it's not working for like a company. You're working on the public taxpayer dollar, and it's a special position for me because I was a foreigner. And I don't know, Louis, you're studying Japanese, so you probably are familiar with this term, but there's gaijin or gaikokujin, and that literally means like gai is outside, koku is country, and jin is person. So it's like the outside country person is foreigner, or gaijin, outsider.
Yeah.
So in a way, there's a certain freedom there because I was a gaijin, I
Your
was an
gaijin
outsider.
pass.
I get my gaijin pass, but I was also an insider because I was working, for the city. And, speaking Japanese kind of also helps you get inside. So it was all of the jobs I've worked have very much been kind of in the cracks. I don't know if that's a good way to describe it, but that's kind of how it feels. And there's a lot of freedom when you're in the cracks because you can kind of define how you'd like your role to be. And yeah, it's a very special place to be. Aim to be in the cracks if you can.
So what other jobs in the cracks have you had?
Well, after working for City Hall in Sapporo, I fell into an interpreter role at Amazon Japan, which was also in Sapporo. So that was an in the cracks role in the sense that Amazon Japan was the only place that had an interpreter internally, because there were all the other Amazon offices didn't have this need to internally translate to English. Like, people in the office and managers knew English, and Amazon, India, China, etc. But Japan, even some of the middle management wasn't very comfortable with English. So they needed interpreter internally. So that's an in the cracks job because in all of the Amazon offices around the world, I had no counterpart. So I really got to define my role there as well.
What was the difference between working in a corporate environment for translation and interpretation and working in, well, like you said, off the taxpayer's dollar in government?
Huge difference. Well, first of all, I go from the fax machine environment to Amazon Japan, and Amazon is a huge cloud computing company, and they did have a fax machine, but nobody used it.
Very high tech.
Gotta stay up with the past, though. Gotta stay up with the past.
Yeah, but in terms of being an interpreter in those two settings was also interesting because you see how language is used in these spheres very differently. So with government, when I was interpreting for the mayor, that we'd have what's called these courtesy calls, and ambassadors from Tokyo, like the ambassador from Pakistan or India or the US, would come to visit the mayor and have these like 20-minute conversations. And of course, there's not a whole lot of business you can do in 20 minutes, but what's important is kind of the impressions and the appearances and the press snippets, right? So it's much more flowery type of interpreting. Like, it really matters how you say what you're saying. Whereas when you go to the private sector with Amazon, it's much more about the what, right? Because business, we just want to know the meat and potatoes of the situation. So that was a huge difference. Yeah, and I didn't have to represent America in my job at Amazon, which was my least favorite part of the first job. But honestly, I think the JET program is amazing, not necessarily because like they have this role called Coordinator of International Relations, or ALT for assistant language teachers, but because it's an excuse for having people from outside Japan live in Japan and make really real connections locally with the people, and the people make connections with people from outside Japan. I mean, work in Japan is quite different than in the West from my experience so far, in that your workplace really becomes kind of your family. Like, if somebody gets married, everybody passes like a basket around to collect money in the office. If somebody has a baby, if somebody had a family member die, I've been to my boss's mom's funeral. Like, you're very much in a family in these offices. So that was kind of common to both offices, but interpreting wise, yeah, language was treated very differently.
And you mentioned how the language is more flowery when you're working in government because there's a certain amount of diplomacy there. Was there ever a time when you just did not know how to translate a specific sentence that was used, and so you just kind of came up with something different to just patch it up?
The great secret of interpreters. To be honest, I was a mediocre interpreter, so I had a lot of those moments. And like I can remember the first like courtesy call I did for the mayor. There was a bunch of an older group actually from the Pacific Northwest in the US visiting. They were a salmon club. Like they go out and observe salmon in the wild, and they came to visit Sapporo because we have a big river that flows through, and it used to be a very dirty river, and they cleaned it up and the salmon came back. Happy story. But I totally didn't catch that half of the story when the mayor was talking about it. So I just said, yeah, the river's really dirty. All the fish left. And that's how I left.
Oh no.
But what's terrible about being an English interpreter in Japan is everybody studies English to some degree in school. So when you mess up, everybody knows. And well, I mean,
they can't really do any better, but they do know.
well, I mean, it takes a certain amount of guts to speak in a foreign language. But, you know, I'm sure of you that have studied foreign languages, you know it's much easier to hear and understand something than to formulate a sentence.
Oh,
and
yeah, definitely.
have the courage to say it out loud. Especially in a setting where there's a bunch of, you know, journalists and newspaper people around. So yeah, it's understandable. But, you know, I had counterparts. Like there was me, I was the English interpreter, and then we had 5 others from the 5 sister cities of Sapporo. So we had a German interpreter, Korean, Chinese, Russian, and eventually like Singapore and France as well. So they could talk about whatever they want. I felt like my German friend could talk about what he had for breakfast and nobody would know. But in my case, everybody knows when you make a mistake.
That is the disadvantage of translating for English, because everyone kind of knows a little English and definitely understands enough to get by understanding that you didn't exactly say what you were supposed to say at that moment.
Yeah, it was psychologically tough, to be honest. Like, because maybe some of your listeners can relate, but I really struggled with imposter syndrome, like since the beginning of my career, and only now I'm getting better at it. But back when I first started interpreting, like, yeah, I got Google Map Guide right into a, you know, City Hall interpreting job with no like formal interpreting experience, and suddenly you're interpreting for like famous people, and it was a big psychological challenge for me.
So how do you fight against that little voice in the back of your head saying, you don't know what you're doing, or you can't do this? What motivation do you use to like combat some of this imposter syndrome you're talking about?
Well, luckily when you're an interpreter, you have a lot of voices in your head, so there was some competition there. But honestly, I think the best thing to do is to fail and fail and fail and fail and realize like, hey, I'm still alive. If you can almost like, I don't know, masochistically become okay with failing and realize that it is through failure that you actually do grow. It's like, you know, it's like weightlifting. You have to like break your muscles in order to build them. That's the only way. And it's not easy in the beginning, but you get used to it. You can get better at failing.
I actually had a English teacher in high school. That was like one of the first activities we did in the class. She would like knot these 2 ropes together, and we had to cross hands with someone and try to like unknot this piece of rope, and no one could figure it out. And that was like our first attempt at failure. And she wrote fail on the board, and under each letter she wrote like first attempt at learning, so it would spell fail. So now every time I think of failure, I think it's your first attempt at learning, and that's how you learn and grow. So
I like that acronym.
Yeah.
That's a good way to look at it.
That is really, really cool. I'm going to start using that.
Fail forward. Yeah.
Fail forward. Exactly.
Yeah, but I think another important aspect is to, like, my life mission now has become not to take myself very seriously. I think, you know, I wasn't a brain surgeon. I mean, I don't think I was exactly in the position to start World War III either at the municipal government, so nothing was really on the line.
I can see the headlines now.
Right, yeah.
Translator in Sapporo, you know.
These things happen. These things do happen, but I figure I could talk my way out of it. But yeah, to realize, you know, what you're doing is not so important to like get your intestines all up in a bundle over is also a freeing realization.
Going back though to when you first arrived in Japan, what was the transition like? Because normally most people, they get out of university and, you know, when they're going onto the job market, they go into a job that's normally in the town of their university or their hometown. But here you went to a completely different country across the sea, across the Pacific, and to like one of the fifth most populous cities in a country that doesn't speak English very well, and with a language that is one of the most different from English as well. How was that whole experience? Like, I imagine it must have been somewhat overwhelming, even though you said you do thrive when you're plopped into an entirely different environment. How was the experience like going completely out on a limb there?
Yeah, to me, it didn't feel so jarring. And maybe because I also did study for a year in Tokyo,
Mm.
study abroad. So it's like Japan wasn't exactly new to me. It was my third time in Japan, but it was my first time working in a government office. But to me, it wasn't so much like the language or the country. It was just all of it was a new experience. And I think it would have been like that no matter where I was.
Mm.
Whether it be a new city that I hadn't lived in the US before or something, like you adapt very quickly without really being so conscious of it.
Now, speaking of the language used in a government office specifically, I assume that they used the professional register of Japanese language, which is notoriously different from, casual language and also just standard Japanese. What was your experience with that? Like, I assume you studied some professional Japanese, but I saw that you got your N1 certification. But
Yeah.
how different is that really from standard Japanese, in your opinion?
Well, that was another point of psychological stress for me. You're talking about keigo, which is one of the honorific forms of speech in Japanese. This type of language isn't limited to just working in the office. It's something you'll see on like signage, you'll hear it on TV or like period dramas or something. It's not like a rarity. It's all around us. But it does add a lot of syllables to every sentence that you're saying. And just how you think when you're conversing with somebody, you're very aware of your social environment, like where everybody stands, like who you should use honorific speech with. And it's not like a mechanical thing, like you look up the charts, like, oh, this person is over 60, I must use this type of language with them. It's like a real sense that that becomes like ingrained in your thinking. I mean, we do it in English as well. We speak differently, like if you're talking with a stranger on the phone, like with customer service, or we kind of have our own version of keigo, I would say. But in Japanese, it's pretty important. And it's pretty difficult to learn for me, and it's easy to make mistakes. And actually, there's a ton of books, and like if you Google stuff online, there's Japanese people asking, "Oh, what language do I use in this situation? What would you use?" So it's not just a second language issue; it's like an issue of really, really deeply understanding the culture.
I mean, I do that in English even. English really throws me off because when I speak French, I use second person plural honorific to distinguish the customer from just like someone that I know, or just literally any stranger, anyone that I'm not familiar with on a personal level. I would never speak in the second person singular. And English really throws me off. And I spent my entire schooling in French, so I was really used to addressing my teachers with different pronouns to mark respect. And then I started studying in English, and I felt really weird about using the pronoun you. So I would always try avoiding saying you, no matter like what the sentence was, who I was like, no matter the teacher, I would try to avoid directly addressing them with you because it felt too informal to me.
Do you feel like your brain is like trying to grasp for some pronoun that isn't there, or what does it feel
Yeah,
like?
it's trying to grasp at like some level of formality that I feel like isn't significantly there because I speak English at home. So English is really associated with informal speech for me. And then when I'm at school or at work, I speak French and I use more formal speech. But when I'm with friends, I use informal speech in French. So I'm used to having two levels of language, but then in English, I only have one. And I feel like I'm lacking a second level, especially then you add on contractions and all of that. And then I'm like, I don't even know. Like my writing, first of all, is completely messed up. The contractions, sometimes I use them, sometimes I don't. That English is really messed up for me because I've never actually had any education in English. But yeah, it's I feel like it's something that lacks, and I feel it's definitely something that other people who don't use English all the time in formal situations feels when they try to address someone formally in English. There's this weird absence of formality in the language.
Yeah, and just like culturally, especially, going from government interpreting to business interpreting, I noticed this. Things are just blunt the way business is done in English.
Yeah.
And that's fine. That's just how it is. But when you're, especially coming from Japanese, or in your case, if you're doing formal things in French, and then trying to like think of the equivalent in English, it's not going to be a literal translation. Um, in the case of Japanese, there's like, there's a bunch of memes on the internet where there's like a Japanese email next to an English email for business. The English one's like one sentence long, and the Japanese is like a whole novel, and the only important information is like at the very, very end.
So this concludes this part of the episode with Claire Froelich. Unfortunately, we ran on for a little bit too long, so we're going to cut it off here. Stay tuned for next week where we'll release part 2. See you then. Bye-bye.